You've also both been very open about traumas that you've experienced in your life. So I'm just wondering if you could, each of you, tell me the connections that you see between Western psychology, trauma, and the spiritual path that you've both been pioneering and pursuing all these years.
Gabor, actually, my experience was backwards from what you described.
Okay.
I had a lot of family trauma, and right. In particular, I had a father who was in many ways mentally ill and violent and abusive, and very, very unpredictable. He was a brilliant scientist, but at home he was a tyrant, and he would beat my mother, and it was an atmosphere of a lot of fear when he was around. For years and years, my mom used to hide bottles behind the curtains so she could pick one up to defend herself in certain rooms, just so she would be a little bit safer, not get thrown onto the floor or down the stairs or something. So that was tough. And then I heard, when I was in the university, studying pre-med to go to medical school,
right,
organic chemistry and all that, I heard Buddhist teachings that there was suffering and that there was also a cause and that there was a path to the end of it. And I got really interested and studied it, and then I decided to go to a Buddhist country and learned all kinds of things which we can talk about, including practices of compassion and forgiveness and mindfulness of the body and many things that now make up good trauma work. And then I came back and I tried to figure out what happened to me after 5 years there. And I went to graduate school in counseling and psychology, and then got a PhD in clinical psychology, and began to realize that what became clear, now it's been 45 years of teaching, as the years unfolded, is that there was a tremendous amount of trauma in the people who came to meditate. Half of them, that's what brought them there, like me. And that we really needed to incorporate a wisdom of that, because a lot of people approach spirituality hoping to transcend, a kind of spiritual bypass. But in fact, you can't meditate. Well, some of them can, but you can't meditate and heal the trauma unless you face it in some way.
Well, thank you. And yes, I remember I did get your history backwards, because I've known about that history before. Something you said about that reminded me of what James Baldwin once said, something like, you can't fix everything that you face, but you can't fix anything that you don't face. So that in order to deal with something, you have to face it. Tara, you talked about your eating disorder, which for me is in every single case a trauma response. It's not one of these mysterious diseases. It's very much one of the outcomes of trauma. What can you say about your path with trauma and psychology and then spiritual work?
Yeah. No, thank you for asking and bringing that in, because my mom was an active alcoholic for most of my time growing up in the household, and I ended up with an eating disorder that became really evident in my teens. I gained a lot of weight, and I was just riddled with shame, and also a perfectionist, trying to achieve, improve myself, and always feeling like I was falling short. Something I came to term as the trance of unworthiness, and I had siblings, fetal alcohol syndrome, with really, it became clear over time the effect of that. So when I was in right towards the end of college, I began doing yoga, and I started getting in my body and more in touch and more awake, and decided to join an ashram, a spiritual community, partly because of the suffering of feeling like I was flawed. And as you said, Gabor, I have now in working with myself, and so many of us have trauma, the shame and the addictive behavior, it all gets paired together. That I can see now a sense of this intelligence in trying to nourish myself and meet unmet needs, through food and also through drugs, when I was in college, and how then those behaviors made me ashamed of myself even more. And I read a very powerful little anonymous story some years back. It's called A Fairy Story. And I read it because it was handed to me by one of my clients. And she described her own coming out of trauma. And we work together a lot with the different kind of practices Jack has referred to. But she described that it was like she was in this closet, shaking out of fear of another attack from her alcoholic father. And she prayed and called on for help. And this good fairy appeared and, said, I can't really help you get rid of all the pain, but what I can do is send it to different parts of your body and kind of tamper it down so you won't feel it so much. And she went ahead and did that. And she said, and the little girl said, but, are you going to leave me? And she said, I'll leave a voice in you. And that voice will be a calling back to wholeness. And even though you'll be, you won't feel the pain as much, and you'll act in ways that, that voice will call you back to wholeness. And when you're ready, when you have the resources, you'll start unpacking and untwisting and undoing that pain and reconnect with your wholeness. And your wholeness has never been taken away. Your soul's always there. It's just been covered over. And I'm sharing that with you, Gabor, because that was kind of how it was. I had this calling towards something spiritual, something whole. And what I came to sense, like there's this severed belonging. I was severed from my body, and I was, severed from feeling real intimacy with others. And there was this calling for some larger belonging. And so that brought me to the ashram and the practices there. It was interesting. They helped me feel a more direct sense of the sacred and how it lived through me. They didn't help me face the actual pain or suffering in my body and heart. It wasn't until I left the ashram and I went to my first Buddhist retreat, and that was, in my early 30s, that I got introduced to mindfulness, and I actually started learning how to re-inhabit my body in a full way. I mean, the yoga got me high, but it didn't really teach me how to pay attention to the parts of me that I was running away from. And so it was through Buddhist meditation, as Jack describes, that's where I was able to begin to integrate and feel more of the wholeness that originally drew me to the spiritual path. And during that transition, I was finishing up my doctorate in psychology, and it was becoming more and more clear that meditation alone wasn't going to do it. It required some of the Western strategies of bringing contents into consciousness, but we need meditation. It's really empowering because then we can start to resource ourselves, and we can talk more about the particulars that meditation offers. But that's what allows us to actually feel that sense of belonging to really something beyond this finite body that really helps us to do all the healing.
Well, thank you. The Buddhist word attachment, but to me, attachment, that kind of attachment arises when we don't get attachment needs met in childhood. So it's the lack of attachment that leads to that other attachment that then has us hooked in addictive ways. I wonder if you'd comment on that.
Yeah, in a way, it goes back to your question about Buddhism and suffering, and trauma is suffering really trauma? And in a way, I think of it that part of just incarnating means that we have a sense of a separate self, and the primal mood of the separate self is fear, and in this society, for the fearful self not to get the attunement it needs to reassure of belonging is trauma. I think there's trauma in most nervous systems because of it, and the basic unmet needs. And I'm thinking of one woman I was with at a retreat, and she didn't have, some overt story of abuse, but there was this sense, this deep sense of not belonging anywhere, of not really trusting she was lovable. And so the process really for us was to sense, well, where do you sense a feeling of loving? And she couldn't go to her parents. She couldn't find it anywhere. And she was grasping, and she would, in her relationship, um, she would be the one to be like really clinging and needy and then feel like it wasn't working. She said when she imagined the love of Jesus, she felt held, and she was wearing a shawl, and she said, if I could just feel this shawl as Jesus. And that's what happened, Gabor, is that she felt that love kind of permeating the shawl, and she was doing a lot of walking meditation because, again, with undoing trauma, movement is so helpful. And that was what began to soften around that basic unmet need of not having the caregivers in the way. And we followed up, and there's a phrase that she loved and I love too, which is, love is always loving you. And that's what trauma blocks us from knowing. And that's what most of us don't know, because we didn't have that mirroring that let us know that we belonged. And for another man who, huge PTSD, very big triggering of fear, it was, know that you're being held in the heart of the Buddha. And for another woman, it was when she was diagnosed and totally terrified with a life-threatening disease and didn't have that sense of belonging. It was for her, she would say, please love me, and feel something, some loving presence of the universe holding her. Sometimes for some people that softens things up enough. Like if we can, I know for myself, I call out to a sense of the beloved and feel that compassion that's so universal coming through. And that's when I can begin to hold myself with more compassion and then actually let in others. So there are different pathways. I think ultimately, if we don't heal in relationship, it's not integrated. But I found for so many that meditation helps them tap something universal that's there but hidden and wake that up.